There is a number that is hovering over our world like a silent storm cloud: $38 trillion. That's how much debt the United States has. Japan is second at $9 trillion. And if you collected every IOU from every government, every corporation, every household on the planet, you'd have a number so large it's almost unreal. $315 trillion is 3 times the total amount of goods and services humanity produces in a year. Yet hardly anyone asks the single logical question: if everyone owes money, then who does everyone owe? Who is the creditor of the earth? The truth is strange and disturbing. We owe money mostly to ourselves, for our banks, our funds, our organizations. But that seemingly harmless truth hides a darker reality. The world today operates within a financial architecture designed so that debt never goes away, and the interest never stops growing. This is not a historical accident. It is not incompetence. It is not a mistake. It was built piece by 4 men over 3 centuries. Each layer adds an important layer. Each person solves a problem in his own time. And together they built a global system in which debt is permanent, global, self-reinforcing, mathematically inevitable. It all started in 1694. Britain was bankrupt, drowning in war costs and on the brink of collapse. There will be no one to lend to the king anymore. Traditional loans will expire. The prince is bankrupt. Merchants refuse new deals. Into this crisis stepped a Scottish merchant named William Paterson, a man whose previous projects failed, but whose imagination never failed. He proposed something no one else had dared to propose: lending money to the crown without ever having to pay back. Not the principal, just profit, forever. In return, create a new institution, one that will outlast kings, wars, dynasties, even nations. Bank of England. Paterson argued that if the state agreed to repay the debt forever, wealthy merchants would happily hand over their gold in exchange for something much more valuable: a permanent claim to the nation's taxes. This is a deal that could reshape the world overnight. Merchants deposited 1.2 million pounds of gold, a huge sum. The bank lent the entire amount to the royal family. The crown pays 8% interest per year, forever. This principle is never touched. What about the paper receipt given to the merchant? They circulate from hand to hand just like money itself. For the first time in human history, debt becomes money, money becomes debt, and national debt becomes permanent debt. Of course, the public has no right to vote, but they will have to pay interest through taxes for centuries. Paterson has just created the first layer of the global debt machine, a system where the state can borrow indefinitely and the people will pay interest forever. But one nation is not enough. For an empire to thrive on debt, the world itself must become a market. A century later, Europe was trembling under the heels of revolution and war. Napoleon moved east. Borders changed. Kings fell. Amidst this chaos, a family emerged whose empire had no land or army, but held more power than most other nations: Rothschild family. The 5 brothers were stationed in the 5 financial capitals of Europe: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples, a network faster than any government courier system. And in the center, Nathan Rothschild, a strategist unlike any of his contemporaries. The government needs money to wage war, but negotiating individual loans is too slow, too risky, and too fragile. Nathan invented something completely new: industrial bond market. He bought government bonds at a discount, resold them at a higher price, and created the first large-scale secondary market for government bonds. Today, government debt can be traded instantly across borders. Debt becomes liquid. Debt becomes global. Debt becomes inevitable. The more interconnected the system, the more dangerous the default becomes. Before the Rothschild era, if a king failed to pay his creditors, the creditors would bear the loss alone. After Rothschild, if a government defaults, the shock spreads to banks, funds, and investors across continents. Default to system collapse. And with that realization, default becomes political. Impossible. No Congress, no monarch, no president would dare cause the economic devastation that default would bring. They have to keep paying and keep borrowing money. Paterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. But the machine still needs one final upgrade: a mechanism to ensure that the government never runs out of lenders. The United States will provide that. In 1907, the United States was in a state of panic. Banks failed. The stock market froze, the money disappeared, and a man stepped into the void, J.P. Morgan. He lured the most powerful bankers in the country into his private library, locked the doors, forced them to cooperate, and through sheer force of personality, saved the American economy. But Morgan saw something deeper. The system relied on the individual, about heroes, thanks to luck. The ensuing crisis could destroy everything, including his empire, if the country did not establish a lasting central government. But Americans despise central banks. They believe they are tools of the wealthy elite. So Morgan and his allies designed something extraordinary. In 1910, under assumed names, a group of the country's most powerful politicians and bankers disappeared on a private ship to a private island off the coast of Georgia. There, in complete secrecy, they wrote the blueprint for the future of American finance. Federal Reserve System. Not a public bank, not a decentralized organization, but a hybrid structure disguised as democracy, but designed for private banks to maintain structural influence forever. 12 regional Federal Reserve banks are owned by member banks. The board of directors is selected by the bankers. Power is concentrated at the New York Federal Reserve, which is controlled by Wall Street. But the biggest innovation is invisible to the public. The Federal Reserve can create money to buy government debt. And with this single possibility, the last obstacle to infinite borrowing disappears. Before the Fed, the government could only borrow what the market would lend. After the Fed came into being, the market became irrelevant. There are always buyers of U.S. government bonds, always. And that means the United States government never has to repay its debt. It can always refinance. It can always borrow more. Debt becomes infinite. 3 centuries, 3 architects, 3 classes. Permanent debt, global debt, infinite debt. Only one piece is missing. A mechanism to ensure that even if countries cannot pay, they stay inside the system. The final piece of the puzzle would come into being in the 1980s under another architect, whose decisions would bind the entire developing world into a global debt cage. And for the first time, this trap is global. By the late 1970s, the global financial machine built by Patterson, Rothschild, and Morgan was powerful enough to shape markets, currencies, and entire national budgets. But one thing is still missing: a mechanism for trapping rest of the inner world. Rich countries like the US, UK, France, and Japan are completely locked into permanent debt structures. But developing countries in Latin America, Africa, and South Asia still have a way out. They may go bankrupt. They can close their capital accounts. They can nationalize industries. They can refuse to play the game. That era ended in 1979 because the fourth architect came and he brought a hammer. His name is Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve. To most people, Volcker is remembered as the man who killed inflation. To economists, he is the architect of the modern dollar system. But for developing nations, he is remembered as the man who unleashed the greatest wave of sovereignty crises in modern history and left half the planet permanently financially dependent. Let's go back. The 1970s were really chaotic. The oil shock, stagflation, the collapse of Bretton Woods. For the first time in generations, currencies were floating freely. Prices are rising out of control. The dollar is weakening. Foreign governments are losing confidence. Something drastic needs to happen. So in 1979, Paul Volcker walked into the Federal Reserve building and did something no one thought possible. He raised interest rates to their highest levels in U.S. history. Not gradually, not cautiously, brutally. The federal funds rate rose from 11% to 20%. Mortgage rates spike above 18%. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment rates skyrocketed. But inflation, the American empire's greatest enemy, eventually collapsed. Volcker's interest rate shock, however, did not stop at U.S. borders. It exploded like a financial earthquake, because during the 1970s, developing countries borrowed billions of dollars dollar-denominated low-interest loans. New highways, dams, factories, power plants are all financed with cheap money. But Volcker's policies tripled global borrowing costs overnight. Countries that owed $40 billion suddenly owed $120 billion in interest. And there is only one currency they can use to pay. The US dollar is more expensive than ever. By 1982, Mexico declared it was no longer able to pay its debts. Brazil followed, Argentina, Chile, Peru. Dozens of countries fell like dominoes. The global debt trap is ripe for expansion, and the system responded exactly as designed. Enter the International Monetary Fund (IMF). Presented to the public as a benevolent financial firefighter, the IMF has become an extension of Volcker's institutional arm, ensuring no country is allowed to run afoul of its debt. Here's how the new mechanism works. A country that cannot pay its debts. The country's economy is collapsing. Bankruptcy, the logical outcome of the market, would wipe out the banks that lent them money in the first place. So the IMF stepped in and came up with rescue packages. But these packages are not real rescue. They have refinancing operations designed to do one thing: maintain interest payments to Western banks. The IMF has lent money not to build schools, not to create jobs, not to strengthen economies, but specifically so that debtor countries can transfer money directly back to their creditors. It was a circular pipe disguised as humanitarian aid. What are the conditions attached? They are brutal. Cut public services, privatize national industries, cut wages, open markets to foreign corporations, remove capital controls, shrink the state, raise taxes on the people. The country becomes stable, not because of the people, but because of the bondholders. This process is called structural adjustment, but in fact, it is a new, more elegant form of imperialism. Old empires used warships and armies. The new empire used spreadsheets and loan covenants. Volcker's IMF mechanism ensures that developing countries can never escape this situation. They can restructure debt, but never eliminate it. They can delay payments, but never stop payments. And above all, they no longer have control over their economic policy. By the mid-1980s, more than 40 countries were permanently bound to IMF conditionality. Many of them are still stuck to this day, paying interest on loans that are older than their government terms. The debt machine has now become, forever, global, infinite. And it was inevitable. But the builders of this system left behind more than institutions and policies. They have created a financial architecture that has the potential to reshape the world's money supply. And here's what most people never realize. Debt is not opposite of money. Debt to be money. Every time the government issues bonds, a new amount of dollars is created somewhere in the financial system. Every time the Federal Reserve buys treasury bonds, the money supply increases. Every time a country borrows money from the IMF, the global dollar network becomes tighter, denser, and more permanent. If the government really returned their debt, the money supply will collapse. Banks will fail. The market will crash. Commercial activities will be frozen. Deflation will tear the economy apart. Debt resolution would destroy the world economy. That is why every politician who promises to pay off the national debt is lying. Not because they are corrupt, but because that cannot be done. Architecture does not allow that. And that architecture has now touched every corner of human life. Your mortgage, bank loans secured by debt securities. Your retirement fund, full of government bonds. What is your insurance policy? Also backed by government bonds. Your savings account, backed by a financial system based on public debt. The modern economic world stands on a mountain of promises that can never be fulfilled and will never be kept, because debt repayment is collapse. Default is contraction. Only expansion maintains the system. This leads to the most important realization. The global debt system does not need to be solved. It works exactly as designed. The government borrows forever. Central banks finance debt. Taxpayers pay interest. Banks and asset management companies earn interest. The machine works. And if any country tries to leave, whether through default, devaluation, capital controls, or nationalization, the system responds with concerted force. Currency collapse, sanctions, market isolation, IMF conditions, political pressure, debt restructuring, change mode, when needed, no way out. Not for Mexico in 1982, not for Greece in 2010, not for Sri Lanka in 2022, not for Argentina in the last 40 years. The great irony is that most people believe that debt is a flaw, a crisis, or a mistake. But for the people who built this system, debt was never a mistake. That's the product. And now the whole world has fully registered it. The end of this story reveals something even darker. Who really gets paid and why this system can't end without the collapse of civilization. If you peel back the layers of the global debt machine, governments, central banks, bond markets, IMF, treaties, balance sheets, you eventually come to one final question: who collects the money? Because every system, no matter how complex, serves someone, and the global debt architecture, built piecemeal by Patterson, Rothschild, Morgan, and Volcker, directs trillions of dollars in a single direction: upward, into the hands of financial institutions that own and manage the world's debt. Let's find out exactly how it works. The invisible rent you have to pay every year: the US government owes more than $38 trillion. Japan debt $9 trillion. Europe debt $14 trillion. China owes the same thing, largely to itself. Add it all together, and the world owes $315 trillion. But here's the part that almost no one understands. Debt is an asset. Someone owns it. Someone collects interest. And that someone isn't some mysterious, shadowy villain. It's a network of organizations that sits quietly at the top of the financial supply chain. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street loyalty major banks, the insurance giants, pension funds, central bank, sovereign investment fund. These institutions hold government bonds because the system makes them attractive. Predictable income, low risk, demand is guaranteed, central bank support, government support. U.S. Treasury bonds alone paid about $1 trillion in profit each year. Where does that trillion come from? Tax. Taxpayers work. Government collects taxes, Treasury pays interest. Organizations receive money. It is the continuous, invisible transfer of wealth from the working population for institutions that own government debt. There is no conspiracy. There is no secret. Just architecture. Circle. No one can escape now. Let's trace a complete loop of the system. 1. The government issues bonds. Promise of interest forever. 2. The central bank creates money to buy those bonds. At the touch of a button, new dollars appear backed by bonds. 3. Banks and funds hold bonds as a safe asset. They use it as collateral for loans, investments, and leverage. 4. Taxpayer-financed interest. Workers, taxes, government, bondholders. 5. Bonds mature and are refinanced, not yet returned, just replaced with a new one. 6. Debt is increasing. Because it has to be. If it contracts, the money supply will collapse. 7. The system becomes more tightly coupled. U.S. debt held by Japan. Japan's debt is held by Europe. European debt held by China. China's debt is held by Chinese banks. It becomes a web spanning many countries. This is the machine. You are inside it. Your country is inside it. Every country is inside it. Debt is no longer a national problem. It is one global structural requirements. Without debt, the modern world would not function. Why debt can never be paid off. Imagine the United States trying to pay off a $38 trillion debt. Where will the $38 trillion come from? It will need to come from bank account, pension fund, insurance group, portfolio, money market, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. But every dollar cut reduces the money supply. How did it go? Deflation. Bank failures, corporate defaults, mass unemployment, Thate market crash, an economy freeze. Paying off debt is structurally impossible, not politically, not ideologically, mathematically. The same applies globally. If every country paid off its debt, the global money supply would drop by 2/3. The world economy would grind to a halt. Debt must increase not because the government is irresponsible, but because the system requires expansion to survive. This is not a mistake. It is fundamental. For architects and their machines. By this point, the nature and dangers of the system had become clear. William Patterson, 1694, creates a permanent national debt, interest forever, paid back. Nathan Rothschild, 1800s, global government debt, default causes systemic disaster, locking Europe into a common network. J.P. Morgan, 1913, create the Federal Reserve, give central banks the ability to buy government bonds with new money, make the demand for debt limitless. Paul Volcker, 1980s. Turn IMF rescue loans into permanent debt chains. Ensure that even if countries collapse, the debt system survives. 4 men, 3 centuries. Architecture. A system in which debt is permanent. Interest rates rise. Default is not allowed. Debt repayment is impossible. Dependence is universal. The perfect trap. The ethical issues that the world ignores. When you study this system long enough, a nagging question arises. Is this a democracy or a financial monarchy in disguise? Governments come and go. Elections don't change anything. Policies change left or right, but the architectural machinery remains intact. Politicians can argue about budgets, taxes, spending. But the core motive of permanent public debt backed by central bank money creation is not up for debate. It is the hidden constitution behind the visible constitution, a structure that drives wealth upwards through compound interest over time and across generations, not by conspiracy, but by design. The last paradox. You cannot vote your way out of this situation. You can't protest your way out of this situation. No nation, however powerful, can escape it. The United States tried in 1835, the only year in history when the country had no national debt. Within 12 months, the economy collapsed. Banks go bankrupt. The government was forced to borrow again. Japan tried in the 1990s. Its economy stagnated for 20 years. Argentina has tried several times. Each time it has returned to the IMF cycle. Greece tried in 2011. It was financially bankrupt until it complied. Because whether a country is democratic, authoritarian, or somewhere in between, debt machine doesn't care. It only cares about making a profit. Upward, always upward. The only way out, and why it will never be allowed, there are only 3 theoretical ways to escape the global debt trap. 1. Default crash the system, cause global panic. Destroy savings, unimaginable. 2. Hyperinflation, destroy the currency. Reboot the system forcefully, equally catastrophic. 3. Rewrite the monetary structure. Abolish central bank debt creation. Back to basics. But this last option will never happen because it threatens bank asset manager, bond market, pension system, central bank, government, corporations. In short, all those who hold power in the modern world. This leaves the global population facing a reality. The system continues. Debt is increasing. Interest income flows in, and no one can escape. Questions no economics textbooks cover. Now that you understand how the machine works, ask yourself, if debt is the foundation of the world, what happens when people no longer believe in that foundation? Because every financial empire in history, from the Roman tax system to the Dutch tulip market to the British gold standard, collapsed not when the numbers stopped working, but when trust stopped working. Confidence is the fuel. Debt is the engine. Interest is the fatigue. If confidence dies, the engine stops. And the next chapter of that story is closer than you think. If you want to understand the next layer of this hidden financial architecture part they never taught in school, then you will want to see what happens next. Because the next truth is even more unpleasant than this.
We must act now.
Look at how fast they are dropping.
This can't be good for the market.
It's crashing.